Cette traversée, oui, cette traversée, c'est extrêmement, c'est très dur, c'est très
This
traumatisant.
crossing is extremely, it's very hard, it's very traumatic. I remember that the most frightening thing was the wait, that interminable wait, because at the end of the day, you're dependent on the smugglers to tell you when you're going to leave. Because the smugglers are in summer, and in summer, autumn, they're pretty swamped, it has to be said. You have to queue for a chance to get on a boat. So sometimes you have to wait a week, several weeks, even several months before they give you the go-ahead. So we remain dependent on these people. We look at our mobile phone, we stay connected on WhatsApp, and one day we receive a message. The message is either here at 6 p.m. or at 7 p.m. and so on. And so, from that moment on, you go to an appointment and you are taken in hand by a group of people who work for smugglers, small smugglers. We call them the staff. They call them the staff today, which is a group of 3 or 4 people who are responsible for getting groups of refugees to the coast by bus, van or on foot, and hiding us in the woods. And from then on, you have to stay hidden for a night, or even 2 or 3 nights, waiting for the boat to be delivered. If the boat is delivered, if the boat can be put together and inflated by the time the staff group arrives. So we're dependent on a whole series of stages. Sometimes the refugees have to do a lot of tests before they can even touch water. The police can stop us before we get to the beach. They can stop us on the way. They can stop us in the woods once the boat is inflated. They can stop us once we're in the water, and once we've touched the water with an inflated boat, normally they say we've won.
Une fois que vous aurez touché l'eau, c'est bon, c'est gagné.
Welcome to Deep Dive from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Jack Megan-Vickers. And this is The Long Tail, Cross-Channel Migrant Smuggling. On the 1st of May this year, the UK Home Office and Border Force announced that 711 people had made the crossing over the Channel from France on small boats. 14 small boats to be precise. That works out at an average of around 51 people per boat. On the day of recording, the latest figures from the Home Office states that 8,826 migrants have crossed the Channel via small boats this year, so far tracking to be the highest ever levels. But despite these potentially record numbers, people smugglers have been operating these routes for years.
So while we have put a lot of focus on migrant smuggling over the Channel in recent years, the history of Channel smuggling is much, much longer. I mean, it has been going on for at least 20-something years.
This is Tuesday Rotano, the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, author of the book Migrant, Refugee, Smuggler, Saviour, and the recent report Small Boats, Big Business, the Industrialisation of Cross-Channel Migrant Smuggling.
What we saw before this rise in small boats trafficking was a lot of trafficking in lorries and trucks. Prospective migrants would climb aboard lorries either known or unknownst to the drivers. In some cases, drivers were taking a fee, putting people into the main truck. In other cases, we had people climbing underneath and holding onto the axles and things like that, but basically trying to get into either the train or into the truck section of the Channel Tunnel to come across. What we're seeing now in this phase is a completely different dynamic. We've referred to it as the industrialisation of small boat smuggling. So whereas all throughout 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, it was a bit on and off. Some groups were trying things with small boats, so you'd see occasional surges, often very different nationalities of both people crossing and the people who are smuggling. But over the course of 2019, there's been a big consolidation. One set of ethnic smugglers has taken control over the route. They've organised themselves all the way back into source countries, and they're now moving a very effective line of new migrants who are marketed from the beginning of their journey as targeting the UK. and coming in organised waves with multiple launches all at the same time. So it's really become a persistent barrage of quite organised and commercial smuggling services. Over the course of 2018 to 2023, in total, about 110,000 migrants have attempted to cross the channel. So you can really see the scale of how big this problem is becoming now.
The idea of using small boats by migrant smugglers is nothing new. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, small fiberglass skiffs were launched from the coast in places like Libya or Tunisia, carrying up to, say, 35 people, aiming for the islands of either Malta, Lampedusa or Sicily. According to a report from the GI called The Human Conveyor Belt, Trends in Human Trafficking and Smuggling in Post-Revolution Libya, it wasn't until 2012 when the really low-quality dinghies began to be used, many originating in China, and we'll come back to that point later. As the report stated, the quality of the vessel used by competing smuggling groups became a race to the bottom. But despite the countless tragedies, hundreds of thousands crossed what Human Rights Watch described as the world's deadliest migration route. But that route over the Mediterranean is not the most popular route. Instead, it's the shorter journey between Turkey and Greece. And this is facilitated by the same set of ethnic smugglers who also control the crossing from northern France to the UK. They control the whole route. So let's go and find them. So there's this car repair shop in a place called Said Sadiq in Iraqi Kurdistan. Nothing too out of the ordinary, it's just a large, relatively nondescript building with sand-covered stones, with painted blue metal beams and blue railings. The large sign is adorned with pictures of cars and tractors and motorbikes. Out the front is one of those large feather flags, a red one which says "Hand Car Wash" in English. The thing that makes this look out of place, or certainly makes you pause, are the three flags fluttering just above the wide entrance. The middle flag shows a golden sun emblazoned on a red, white and green horizontal tricolour. That's the Kurdish flag. But to the right is the flag of the EU, and to the left, the unmistakable flag of the United Kingdom. Pretty strange for a car garage in Iraq. Not far away is the house of the owner of the car repair shop, and it's certainly grand. On either side of the steps to the property are a couple of columns that, to me at least, looked like a simplified version of those found at the Küçüksu Pavilion in Istanbul. They support a rather ornate entablature, and finally a huge heavy dark wood door. Basically, this house is rather fancy. To build such a lavish property would cost a lot, and it's alleged that the owner made his money in migrant smuggling in Calais. And that repair garage is a hub for migrants looking to make the journey to Europe and the UK. Now, for quite a while in the UK, the attention of the British media fell on the Albanian smuggling gangs. But actually, those criminal networks who control the smuggling routes from source to destination, including the small boats that cross the channel, are Kurds, who are spread across Turkey, Iran, Syria, and yes, Iraq.
The control over the channel smuggling route now is almost exclusively Kurdish. And they have had a very long-standing history of smuggling to the UK, often for national or linguistic reasons. In fact, one of the first cross-channel smuggling networks that was revealed, which was in 2005, was run by Turkish Kurds. So they were even involved back in the truck smuggling days. So Kurdish groups, particularly it seems to be Iraqi Kurds, have really consolidated control over the launching points on the North French coast. We managed to do a rough schematic, actually, of which groups are controlling. And it is done in sort of subsets based upon their hometowns. They have a certain amount of territory from which they would launch the smuggling journeys of their own. And we saw, for example, groups from Erbil, from Rania, from Shazaror in Iraqi Kurdistan, and from Sardasht in Iran. And these smugglers are facilitating the journey all the way through and then from their launching points. The distinction here between the Albanians is actually the Albanian criminal groups who are associated with what we refer to as organized immigration crime were essentially just recruiting the people and then buying the places on the boats. So the logistics of the smuggling was done by the Kurds, whereas the recruitment of the people was being done by the Albanians. And so the focus that was placed by certainly UK law enforcement on preventing Albanian smuggling was not something that was going to touch the underlying transport infrastructure that was being provided by another criminal sect altogether.
From the streets of Iraqi Kurdistan to the streets of the UK, these organised criminal groups have operators at each necessary stage. But the criminal bosses do not deal with the actual boats and migrants. Generally, they stay under the radar.
Most of them belong to Kurdish Iraqis, but obviously it's difficult to locate the people behind this business.
This is Julien Gaudichaud, a documentary filmmaker who's been reporting on people smugglers who operate in Calais for a number of years. And those words at the very start of this episode describing the wait to get on a small boat, that was Julien's own experience of crossing the channel.
I've seen a few of them, but from what I saw during my investigation, some are in Iraqi Kurdistan, in their country of origin. Others are in England and others in Germany. In any case, they are not on the coast. They're not in France. They're not close to everything that's going on. Having spoken to one of them not long ago, he said that he controlled everything in England with his phone.
It's important to note that these routes are not centrally controlled, so there isn't a single mafia-style group lording it over the whole thing. It's more like specific territorial control, akin to drug gangs. So if one group starts encroaching on the territory of another, well, you get the idea. There was this one story from 2022 reported by The Times that took place in the Grand Descente camp near Dunkirk. A witness described how men armed with Kalashnikovs and pistols took part in a shootout, resulting in 3 people being injured before law enforcement stepped in. Around the same time, there was a Europe-wide operation against an Iraqi Kurdish criminal group which led to 39 arrests. It was carried out by the Operational Task Force June, an operation that we'll come back to later. But in the context of violence, one of the things Europol revealed was that the rivalries between this group and others had led to 2 attempted murders in both France and Germany. Finally, last year, a GI investigation in Iraq revealed that 2 rival Kurdish groups originating in Erbil and Sharazur fought over the smuggling route in Dunkirk. It was won by the group from Sharazur, and the Erbil group has since declined in significance. Here's Julien.
The Kurdish Iraqi group of smugglers get on quite well with each other in Dunkirk, because everyone has something to lose if there's a war going on all the time. But there are so many people, and it's so noisy, that there are bound to be altercations and settling scores. And very often, the settlement of scores is made between the small hands in the camps. What's happening, and what's a bit new, is that the little hands are now armed. So in the camps, the little hands of each group are armed, have pistols, even Kalashnikovs for some. And these weapons are buried here and there in the camps. And when there's a problem, the little hands dig up the weapons, and then they settle the score in the camps. Quite simply, because there's far too much money in circulation, far too much money at stake. And so I think you have to arm yourself when you are a people smuggler to show that if someone comes to encroach on your territory and bother your business, you're capable of defending yourself. You won't hesitate to defend yourself. You won't hesitate to kill.
Regular listeners to Deep Dive will know that sometimes criminals embellish and even at times lie. I know, it's shocking. There was this one smuggler who joked to the GI that his gang had more weapons than NATO in Calais. But I guess this is illustrative of the fact that these gangs are armed and willing to use violence. As Julien said, violence does happen between groups, but there seems to be a fairly good understanding that excessive violence brings more unwanted attention from law enforcement than they already get. And so if collaboration is possible, it's preferable. Here's Tuesday again.
So what's been really interesting in our research has been that, if one smuggling group has found that they have too many migrants to move at one particular point, they'll collaborate with another Kurdish subset slightly further down the coast to move the migrants over, give them transit to them instead. So they will cooperate where they have to, but when they don't, they will fight violently, including gunfights and battles and people dying, over their ability to control those places. What they do not seem to be doing, though, at this point is jeopardizing the business model entirely. So very much there is still a clear common enemy in the enforcement measures that are being taken. They will not turn each other in, but they will fight in their points of both where the migrants are being held. It's gotten further and further away from the coast. So actually there are less clashes than there used to be in terms of the migrants when they're being held, but there are still over the departure points on the coast.
And violence is not just between the gangs. The migrants can also be treated harshly. Violence as a threat can be used to keep migrants in line and also loyal against potential rivals.
There have been limited numbers of reports of attacks on migrants during their journey. Most of the harm that is being done to migrants is through the dangers of the crossing. There have been some examples of physical violence, but certainly not killing. We had some migrants who documented that their children had been slapped or hit. But given the scale of the number of people moving, actually, I would say that the violence levels are relatively low, far lower than they could be, and far lower than they were for the equivalent level of organisation in southern Libya, for example.
There's this Telegram channel in Farsi, which is the official language in Iran and Afghanistan. Much of the discussion contains questions from migrants about getting to different parts of Europe, with instructions about what to do when you arrive in places, where to go, where the camps are, and so on. People are quite openly talking about migrant smuggling. So you'll get exchanges like this.
Hello. If anyone wants to go from Turkey to Germany, how much will it cost?
It depends on how you go. You can spend as much as you want, but it will cost you at least 500 euros. If you want to go with a smuggler, the average is around 10,000 euros. If the smugglers are honest, less. If they are the smugglers who care about nothing but money, more.
Sometimes it might be offering something.
This address in Paris. I have food every night from 5 to 6 p.m. Sleeping bag with tent in Paris.
Or another person asking,
Hello. Does anyone know the price of the boat from Calais to England?
And a reply quickly followed.
From Calais, 2,500. From Dunkirk, 1,000 and above.
Before another user added,
The survival rate from Calais is 80%. From Dunkirk, 50%.
There was one specific account who often posts advice and instructions. He'd provide advice on what to say to authorities once you arrive in the UK.
Answer the questions they ask you very briefly and completely. Why did you come here and become a refugee? My life was in danger. Why is your life in danger? Due to religious, political, social, ethnic activities. Do you have the documents with you? No, I do not have. Can you get it? I don't know. I'm not sure, but I will do it if I can.
Social media, like this Telegram channel, is an important source of information for migrants willing to risk the journey across the channel between France and the UK. There have been investigations showing the use of social media to attract migrants. The French outlet Arte showed how TikTok was being used. The BBC showed WhatsApp. Within the structure of the criminal groups, you have recruiters. Their job is to sell the journey. So you'll see messages like, to London, 100% sure, no chance of failure. These are the best prices in the market. On the other side, we've seen states and law enforcement use social media to urge people not to make the journey. The UK first targeted migrants from Albania with a social media campaign. Now the UK Home Office has launched an ad campaign in Vietnam talking about the dangers of the crossing, attempting to dissuade people from making the journey. Then more broadly, a series of interviews with Border Force officers highlighting the reality of the crossing.
People smugglers are risking lives, human lives, just to gain money. However, it's not worth the risk for life. I've seen people suffer family deaths during these journeys, and, you know, at the time they would say, was this really worth it?
I've been down to Dover, Folkestone, and I've seen these inflatable boats coming in with illegal migrants, and the conditions are awful. I've seen people on the verge of hypothermia. I've seen children come in with no life jackets. From time to time, they would take off late at night, freezing cold waters between the busiest shipping channel.
But despite the use of social media, for many of those who decide to make the journey, it's word of mouth that has the most pull. And in organised crime, branding and reputation are incredibly important. It's a world inhabited by liars and thieves, so trust is hard to come by.
Everybody knows a person who had taken the road. Everyone who is wanted to come to Western Europe, it's like they know a person who had been through that journey.
This is Afshin Ismaileh, a journalist and war photographer from Norway.
And it's the word of the mouth. I was just a smuggler. And it comes to the branding, price, how good the smuggler is, these things. But when it comes to the international recruitment, then it's like sometimes it's happening with the social media. But it's like the trust is low there. When it comes, you find a person you don't know, you never heard about it in the social media. There is low trust in there. Most of it, I think, is like based on connections, networking, and word of mouth. Like smugglers, as well knowing people who are in other countries, which they can sell you to other smugglers in other countries.
The word of mouth aspect of this is quite revealing in other ways. By asking people who've maybe made this journey before, it can help a person decide whether it's worth it or not, and perhaps provide a dose of reality as to what it's really like. But what's also interesting about some of those who've made the journey before is that they themselves become smugglers. Here's Julien.
Oui, il y en a pas mal qui
yes, there are quite a few who have made this same journey and who have found themselves having to cross the channel or having to get on a lorry or climb on a train to get to England. And once they got to England, they said to themselves, wait a minute, there's still a lot of money to be made. Two other people, smugglers, told me, I arrived in Calais like the others. I found myself having to cross. I worked with the boatman for a while. I learned what was going on. I saw a bit of the inner workings of this organization. And then it was my turn to cross. Once I'd crossed, well, I had the papers in England. So I started this thing. There are also some in Germany. But yes, for the most part, it's a business that caters for a community. The Kurdish Iraqi community is made out of people who've come from Iraqi Kurdistan and who know how to speak and how to talk to their relatives and who know how to organize things. So very often, these are people who have left the country and traveled through Turkey, who have traveled through the Balkans and have arrived in France.
Let me tell you this one story about an Iranian Kurd called Hiwa Rahimpour. Although Sky News discovered that not only was he from Erbil, which is in Iraqi Kurdistan, not Iran, but that his name was actually Hamakoshna. Anyway, in 2016, Rahimpour arrived in the UK and was given leave to remain in 2020, opening a barber shop in London.
You can ask all the neighbours who was like gold. We didn't even believe, that's like I said to you, you don't know who's next door to you. It was just a shocking for all of us. Because he
nice guy.
had, like, I see all the neighbours, because obviously I'm in hairdressers and we know, and I see so many guys going by, you know, saluting him, you know, talking to him, and he was nice. He was nice to everyone around here, to be honest.
His landlady here was speaking to Sky News just after Rahimpour's arrest, and you can hear how she was in disbelief at the allegations, because Rahimpour was actually running a significant migrant smuggling outfit. He did all of the usual stuff, purchasing boats, engines and life jackets from Turkey, getting it all shipped to Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, and from there the boats would be moved to the northern coast of France to Calais or Dunkirk. According to some, Rahimpour's gang was responsible for 10% of the crossings over a 12 to 18 month period, some of which resulted in deaths. Eventually, Rahimpour was arrested in the UK and deported to Belgium, where he has since been convicted and jailed for 11 years. He also received a fine of €80,000. But given Europol estimates that Rahimpour's gang generated nearly €60 million in 2021 alone, the sentence and fine will be unlikely to deter others. Then there was another story from April 2019 when an Iraqi Kurd who arrived in Dover after paying £2,000 to smugglers to get him across to the UK, he came across by hiding on top of a lorry. His name was Nazar Jabbar Muhammad. Once he settled, he continued his work, the smuggling of migrants. He once boasted that he'd smuggled too many women and I brought more than 100 over. But what Nazar didn't realise was that the National Crime Agency was monitoring him. So they heard his arguments with other gang members in France and Belgium over a dinghy that had gone missing. He was trying to arrange a crossing for 21 migrants, which would have netted him around £200,000 as he was charging each migrant £10,000. Thankfully, before that crossing could be made, Nazar was arrested, just months after he arrived in the UK. He was subsequently jailed for 10 years back in 2021. So why are Kurdish groups so prevalent in the smuggling industry? Here's Afshin.
There is a joke in Kurdistan which says that one day God visited hell. And he went to different parts of the hell. Everybody was suffering a lot. Different parts which belongs to different countries. Then which he made it to the Kurdish side, and he found out that everybody is happy, dancing, drinking wine, good food and everything. He sent some angels to find out what's going on here. At the end, the angels found out that the Kurdish people in hell, they are smuggling from paradise to hell. So that's the joke that is allowed and made in the Kurdistan. And it shows that how they are, they are good in it. With this experience, they have it from their region. So they bring it to different countries in Europe. Then it comes a lot of them to Greece, to France, to Italy, to different parts of these countries, which is like the main, the transit route to Western Europe. And they brought this experience to these countries as well. So it makes them to stay there and becomes... And it's, of course, it's a good money in smuggling business.
If you look at a map of where Kurdistan is located, it stretches over a number of countries, so Turkey, Iran, Iraq and Syria. In Iran you have the mighty Zagros Mountains where the Kurds live. This happens to be on the migrant route out of the east for those travelling from Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India. There is this Kurdish saying, "No friends but the mountains." Historically, the Kurds have suffered persecution. Many left their ancestral homes and travelled, often with the help of smugglers, into Europe. This meant that there's now a significant Kurdish diaspora spread across the continent. Within these communities, there are some, like Rahimpour and Muhammad, that have become part of the migrant smuggling ecosystem. For example, let's look at another story of a smuggler who spoke to the GI, who we called Karwan.
He was a migrant who comes to UK and become a refugee there and got asylum in UK. Because of that, you get some experience from it. So you know a lot of people on the road. You become acquaintance with a lot of people, the smugglers and different people who are in charge of the road. So you make a connection, you build a network. He was one of the ones from Suleymania in Kurdish side. He's got his own part in Kalas or in the French side. So he's bringing the people from the same route, like with the rubber boats and different other boats, like you have the trucks as well. So he brings people from there, but he's living fast, like he's permanently living in the UK.
After making that original journey from Iraqi Kurdistan, Karwan has been in the smuggling game for about 5 years and now supervises a 15-person outfit, including Albanians and Arabs, but mainly trusted people from his hometown. Karwan has alliances with smugglers along the route based in Iraq, Turkey and Greece. Each time a migrant is delivered, from one to another and then on to another and so on. But once the migrants arrive in France, his people take over and they move the migrants towards the coast. His network, which spreads from Iraq to the UK, is illustrative of the size and organisation of the migrant smuggling networks. The GI's research identified the 4 main Iranian Kurd networks operating in France. The leader of one was nicknamed Apple. and was the only one using a UK number. Apple also has a pretty good reputation because of the quality of the boats, engines, and importantly, a tendency to not overload the boats. But the thing I found most interesting was that for an extra fee of 1,000 to 1,500 euros, Apple would arrange legal support for the migrant if they were arrested on arrival. That being said, Apple is also known to use violence against those who don't pay. But this got me thinking about the different deals that are available to migrants. This is a competitive market, and the smugglers, they're all vying for customers. Here's Tuesday.
So these are very classic models of migrant smuggling, and you see the same terminology used all the way around the world for the way that migrants negotiate their journeys with smugglers. And there are certain markers which suggest better organization and better consolidation. And these are all hierarchied by price. And I think this is why, for me, the channel has become so fascinating, because I did not expect to see written about a central Western European route exactly the same kind of language and analysis that I was using when we were talking about the Mediterranean route to Libya, the same thing that we talked about when we were talking about West African migrants moving across the world 20, 30 years ago. So really, all of these markers of industrialization are fascinating. And the more organized and formalized and full package a service that a smuggler can provide is a sign of how well established they are.
So this is really interesting. You have a couple of different categories, pay-as-you-go or full package deal. Pay-as-you-go is fairly self-explanatory. The migrant still controls their journey, making micro-payments for each step, hopping from country to country, negotiating with smugglers along the way. But the full package, well, it covers the whole thing.
So they are making a promise or a deal around a final destination. You know, this is a journey all the way to the UK. They may include multiple attempts. So your fixed price will include 3 tries, 3 boat launches, and you should succeed on one of them. It may include support in everything from planning the journey, having fraudulent documentation ready to use to either support an asylum claim or to try and look like you're in a country legitimately. And now we are seeing more in the UK, actually smugglers offering support for integration. So they'll help you find a place to live. They may help you find a job. They'll connect you in with the social services to begin your asylum processing claim. What we've seen so far is that a lot of the fake passports, because of the nature, I think, of the geography and the route, a lot of the fake passports that migrants are procuring have been made in Turkey, which is a known hub for document fraud. One of our sources reported in that some of the most expensive and high quality of the documents are actually fake Israeli passports that were made in Thailand. Thailand is another major source for document fraud. That the packages are being advertised online, that the migrants are using encrypted services like Telegram to communicate. There's advertising. They're responding and finding their smugglers through Telegram groups before moving on to direct messaging. And the packages are ranging between 3 to 10K.
That is a lot of money, and some of the adverts on social media have indicated prices for Iraqi or Iranian migrants of 8,000 euros to get to Germany via Turkey and Belarus. And while we're on about money, perhaps we should talk about how to pay for these package deals, because they're financed through a system called Hawala. Now, this is a very old form of value transfer system. It operates outside the legitimate banking system and is essentially based on trust.
Hawala is an informal banking system that serves to facilitate financial transfers around the world that do not use any of the formal banking methodologies. So it doesn't rely on Western Union, it doesn't rely on any other value transfer or phone banking, doesn't touch in any way the international financial system. Hawala usually works through a network of trusted partners who will have an agent in a migrant receiving area and a migrant sending area and places where those diaspora exist in large numbers. And they essentially keep books that allow them to offset payments between each other. So the money never actually physically moves. It's just notes of credit. A payment will be made, say, by a migrant's family at home. And then that money will be ledgered at the home destination. And then it will be through just a ledger transfer. So one Hawaladar will contact another and say, oh, I have 100,000 for this guy. You release this payment now. We'll offset that against other credits that you have going the opposite direction. What Hawala typically uses in order to settle the final balance of payments, if there is a credit or a debit to one Hawaladar in particular, is trade-based money laundering. So it tends to go hand in hand with misinvoicing of trade, very much in cash-based economies. So supermarkets, restaurants will do trade under invoicing or over invoicing to declare the value of goods on import or export or on purchase. And that money, the differential, will be what settles the balance of payments at the end of those sort of Hawala transaction period. And typically they'll settle up once every couple of months.
Hawala can be popular with money launderers and terrorists because of the informal nature and lack of regulatory supervision, but it's also popular because of a lack of a paper trail. It's these concerns that make Hawala illegal in places like India and the US, but it isn't illegal in the UK. And that brings me back to social media. I was perusing Telegram and stumbled across this one exchange from last September, when in a specific group that regularly discusses small boat crossings, a user asked,
"Hello? We arrived in England. How can we send a message to get the money released?"
At which point someone responded,
"You can call your family and tell them that you have arrived, and your family will call the cashier and the smuggler's money will be released."
And this short exchange reminded me of this story about a guy called Ashgar Geshlagian, aka Mr. G, an Iranian who lived and worked in London where he ran a rug company, although this of course was a front for his role as an unregistered Hawaladar.
Please stop your phone.
Thank you.
Right, I'm arresting you for money laundering. You do not have to say anything to may harm your defence if you do not mention one question, something which you later rely in courts, and if you do so may be given evidence. Get hand, please.
Mr. Geshlagian.
Yes.
National Crime Agency. This is my colleague. We have a warrant to search these premises. Okay?
This was the moment Geshlagian was arrested by the UK's National Crime Agency. Geshlagian's role as a Hawaladar meant that he accepted payment from migrants and their families, and then released the money to the criminal gangs once the journey was completed. He would get his little commission out of it. Undercover recordings revealed Geshlagian admitting that 70 to 80% of his business was illegal. The NCA seized £50,000 in cash from his home and were able to see around £1.6 million in payments had gone into his bank accounts. Geshlagian was subsequently sentenced to 8 years for money laundering and facilitating illegal immigration earlier this year. But what about when a smuggler gets arrested and convicted, perhaps the leader of a network? Well, the Hawala system means that after the sentence is carried out, the released smuggler's funds could very well just be waiting for him. Here's Julien.
Then the payments for the trips are made. The money is deposited in cash in their country of origin in Iraqi Kurdistan. So there are millions of euros circulating in Iraqi Kurdistan in small banks or in other countries of origin like Albania and so on. Then it's transferred to Iraqi Kurdistan, and the journeys are paid for in these countries. So, when we arrest a smuggler in England or France, we can prove that he was involved in the crossings, that he was involved in this and that. But we don't seize all the millions of euros. So, when this smuggler gets out, depending on his sentence, between 3 and 8 years, he'll get out. There's a lot of money waiting for him in his own country.
Now, it's always interesting to try and work out how much an illicit industry is worth. And as we heard earlier from Julien, there is a lot of money to be made in smuggling migrants. So let's take a look at the numbers. Between 2018 and 2023, in total 110,000 migrants attempted to cross the channel. The average cost of a place on a small boat is between 2,500 and 3,000 euros. Each boat is carrying around 50 people. That's between 125,000 to 150,000 per boat. One smuggler who spoke to a colleague at the GI estimated that smuggling networks earn more than 920,000 euros a month, which over the course of a year is well into the millions. The French Office for the Fight Against Illegal Trafficking of Migrants estimate that in 2022 the industry was worth around 150 million euros. But saying that, the overheads are significant. Here's Tuesday.
Migrant smuggling as a criminal industry is quite expensive because people are big and they are complicated to move. So I think you have to factor in actually the real costs of the journey. We've done some research into the cost of boats, for example. One boat is probably costing 10,000, 15,000. They have been getting bigger, they have been getting cheaper. But then at the same time, efforts to interdict the boats, both when they land in European ports, and the evidence suggests so far that they are being made in China and being imported through ports in Germany and in the Netherlands. That has gone up, so that will make everything more expensive. The big variable is the cost of corruption. So how much are the migrant smuggling networks paying to border guards, customs officials, perhaps diplomatic personnel to get people out of their countries, to move them along different points in the route, to ensure that they are not stopped on their journey to the coast and at their launching points. Payments are also made to the people who own land at various launching points. So I would suggest that while the intake, the total gross intake is probably high, and that you do on the simple maths, when you begin to net out the actual costs and the number of people who are involved in having to deal with those large groups of migrants on the move, the profit margin is smaller. That said, there is definitely still a profit. And our research in Kurdistan suggested and showed quite clearly that money is flowing in that is coming directly from the organization of migrant smuggling, but it isn't as profitable as the overall top line numbers would suggest.
Let's just take a moment to talk about the boats themselves, because they are quite interesting in their own right. Predominantly the boats used are RIBs, which stands for rigid hulled inflatable boats. They need an outboard motor mounted on the back. Now, you can't go to your local shops on the coast of France. For example, the sports equipment store Decathlon refuses to stock items like canoes or dinghies to prevent them being used in this way. But organised criminals are much more, well, organised than just buying boats from the local shop. So to get one of these, usually around 8 meters long and 2 meters wide, you can order them from China. They cost a few thousand on websites like Alibaba, and you can also spend about $1,300 on an outboard motor. These boats are then sent via container to Turkey before being sent on to Central and Northwest Europe for storage, before finally being transported to France on the day of departure. 90% of the equipment that's used to cross the channel is transported from Germany. The gangs use drivers who are asylum seekers themselves, who can earn between 300 to 2,000 euros for transporting a boat to France. The logistic costs of getting a boat to the coast is around 10,000 euros per boat. And we know that a single boat can earn a criminal group over 100,000 euros, so you can see the profitability. Now let's quickly turn back to Operational Task Force June that we briefly mentioned earlier, which targeted an Iraqi Kurd criminal network. This operation led to the arrests of 39 people across Northern Europe, including 3 high-value targets, so these are the potential bosses. Of those arrested were so-called logistical cells in Germany and the Netherlands, whose role it was to source the necessary equipment for boat crossings in Europe and beyond. Then you had the UK-based Hawaladars. Over 50 locations were searched and a load of equipment was seized. 1,200 life jackets, around 150 rubber boats, 50 engines, 40,000 euros in cash, firearms, cars and drugs. Now this is where it gets interesting, because the gang allegedly charged an average of between 2,500 to 3,500 euros per migrant. The cost depended on the nationality of the migrant. They would launch up to 15 boats simultaneously, expecting about half of them to make it to the UK. This group reportedly smuggled up to 10,000 migrants and made an estimated 15 million euros over the course of 18 months. And let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that all of those 150 inflatable boats that were seized by law enforcement had made it across the channel, each carrying an average of 50 people, who had each paid between 2,500 and 3,500 euros for a place. That works out at between 18 and 26 million euros. In February this year, Europol's Operational Task Force WAVE, which followed on from June, also dismantled a significant smuggling network comprised of Iraqi and Syrian Kurds based in Germany, alleged to be responsible for small boat crossings between France and the UK. This time 19 arrests were made, including 5 high-value targets, along with a bunch of equipment. Europol described the boats as low quality, mainly originating from China, transported via Turkey to Germany, and not safe to carry more than 10 people. But of course, the criminal gangs put around 50 migrants in each boat, charging between 1,000 and 3,000 euros per person. And finally, in addition to all of this, earlier we heard about how many of those involved in smuggling gangs were once migrants themselves, who learnt the tricks of the trade and decided to get involved. Well, some of the criminal networks help would-be smugglers set up. For say 10,000 euros, they will buy and deliver a rib for the new smuggler, and the Kurdish networks still decide when, where, and who launches a boat. Now, as we heard earlier, for a long time the media focus was on Albanian gangs supposedly running the Channel migrant networks, but subsequently it was revealed that they were facilitators and recruiters. The routes themselves are controlled by the Kurdish groups. And this raises some interesting questions about the future. You see, groups from the Western Balkans, particularly the Albanians, have catapulted themselves to the upper echelons of multiple illicit markets in Europe, and in particular cocaine, and they have expanded internationally. It's becoming somewhat of a catchphrase for me on this series, but organised criminal groups are rarely monolithic these days. As criminal markets wax and wane, criminal groups diversify their portfolios. The question is, given how organised these Kurdish smuggling networks have become, how long will it be until we see them pushing into other illicit markets? And if they do so, how will those already established react to this incursion? Because, unsurprisingly, organised crime violently protects its interests. Here's Tuesday.
The Kurds, they've always been very limited low-level players in Europe. So it is really interesting, and I think of far greater significance, to see them consolidate so effectively around what is becoming a very lucrative route without more competition from other organised crime. If you look at the research from our Balkans Observatory and a lot of the emphasis around the rise of Albanian organised crime in Europe, for example, and I mean, I recommend to anybody to go and listen to one of our earlier podcasts on EncroChat, which really talked a lot about the dynamics of organised crime in Europe, because that investigation really revealed how incredibly violent, how profitable, how ruthless organised crime has become in Europe and how many different nationalities are active there. I would say the fact that the Kurds have managed to earmark as much space as they have around migrant smuggling, which is now a highly visible form of organised crime, is a really telling finding. And I would worry more now about what role they're going to develop in the years to come. So obviously, if you look around Iraq, Kurdistan, Turkey, the region that they come from is on the heroin route from Afghanistan. Heroin production and trafficking is at the highest levels it's been in a long time. We have recently done some research on the Iran-Iraq border in Iraqi Kurdistan. There's a lot of reporting there around rising methamphetamine production and trafficking. So what will be interesting to see is whether or not they turn the infrastructure that they've created for the movement of migrants into the movement of other illicit commodities, including narcotics. And I think there's a great potential for harm there. And it may be, as they move away from migrant smuggling, that will bring them into greater conflict with other forms of organised crime. The Albanians, for example, we may see less cooperation than we've seen thus far, and potential rises in violent clashes around new markets.
Finally, we might ask the question on how to deal with this issue. The reality is that it's really hard. Dismantling gangs has an effect to an extent, but those are just individual gangs. By taking them down, prices go up, and the other gangs make more money. And then eventually another gang takes the disrupted gang's place. Here's Julien.
Having been to court several times to observe the investigations into these gangs of people smugglers, the investigations take a long time. So the police often manage to identify part of this criminal group. They don't manage to locate another part. They don't know the last small part. What the authorities want to know is that they have brought down an entire network, because in fact, if they arrest just a few small hands, or just one intermediary, or just one other person, it will be very easy to replace him. The chain will still be organized and business will resume. So their intention is to bring down the whole network from A to Z. And unfortunately, these people are highly mobile, moving from one country to another, from one town to another, changing their phone all the time. So it's complicated to be able to locate them all, to do a one-off net search. So these investigations often take between 6 months and a year, or even longer.
Entre 6 mois et 1 an, voire plus.
As we heard at the start of this podcast, so far, if the current rate of small boats crossings continues, 2024 will break the previous records for migrant numbers making this journey. Of course, with an election looming in the UK, this is an important electoral issue, and the two major parties have differing views on how to deal with this problem. From the current government's UK-Rwanda Migration Economic Development Partnership, otherwise known as the Rwanda Plan, to the main opposition Labour Party's proposal to create a new law enforcement unit called the Cross-Border Police Unit, specifically designed to target the small boat operators. But the problem remains. If people want to come to places like the UK and a legal route is not an option, they will turn to the irregular path. And the reality is that if there is money to be made, organised criminal groups will serve that need. As was pointed out in the GI Small Boats report, the higher the obstacle, the more people will turn to smugglers, who, in turn, will charge more for riskier approaches to infiltrate their clients into the UK. Here's Tuesday.
So what our research globally on the smuggling of migrants has shown is that heavily focused enforcement efforts, militarization of borders, building up stronger and stronger border controls, really feeds into the smugglers more than it does anything else. So when does a migrant need a smuggler? When a journey is hard to make, when it's one they can't do by themselves. The harder you make the journey, the more criminal the provider has to be in order to be able to circumvent those barriers. So if you have a highly militarized border with a lot of enforcement, heavy penalties, smugglers are going to want to charge a lot for that, so it becomes profitable. It's dangerous, so only the most effective smugglers are going to be able to survive. And typically then those are the most professional, violent and wealthy, least sympathetic groups of organised crime. In an ideal world, I think, safe and legal routes for migration, particularly for migrant populations who have had a long-standing interest in particular geographic corridors. So the reason why the Kurds have been so effective in controlling the smuggling route from source to destination in the UK is because Kurds have historically always wanted to go to the UK. So a better way of managing the migration flow would be to set up a limited number of safe, legal routes for migration into the UK. Instead, the efforts focus on reducing as much as possible or narrowing as much as possible the opportunities for people from the region to move to the UK, forcing them into irregular or legal channels, forcing them then to use the services of a facilitator to make those journeys and to finish that journey in the UK and to access the asylum system. And then by ratcheting up the level of enforcement, increasingly pushing those migrants who, if they have wanted to make that journey for tens of decades, they will continue wanting to do so, pushing them into the hands of ever increasingly more organised, professional, violent, ruthless and expensive smuggling groups.
That's it for this episode of Deep Dive. I'd like to thank Tuesday, Afshin and Julien for speaking to me. If you'd like to read the GI's report, Small Boats, Big Business, the Industrialisation of Cross-Channel Migrant Smuggling, you'll find a link in the podcast notes, as well as a link to all the relevant research links from this episode. If you'd like to check out more of our research into organised crime around the world, our website is globalinitiative.net. You've been listening to Deep Dive from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I'm Jack Megan-Vickers. Thanks for listening.